Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Marius. I'm really happy to be here with you all. And I also want to say that despite what Marius just said, technically I might wear the chair hat at Neuromatch Academy, but it is not me who is doing the heavy lifting alone. There's like 200 plus organizers, and it's a massive and incredible group effort. And Marius has been leading the charge on some of the publications coming out of it from last year as well. So definitely not doing that alone, and couldn't do it without everybody else there. So I wanted to say that. So I'm today, though, going to talk about consciousness and metacognition and maybe a computational framework between that might link the two and that might help us get a handle on consciousness. I'm going to veer away from the philosophy side of this project, these series of projects, and more towards the psychophysics and computational modeling side. And I'm not going to talk about some of the work we've been doing with machine learning approaches to understanding neural representations of information and how information is flowing throughout the brain. So if we want to talk about some of that stuff later, some of the approaches we've been using with like deep networks and autoencoders, we can definitely do that, but I'm not going to talk about that stuff today. Today, I'm just going to talk about psychophysics and metacognition and computational modeling and a little bit of that neuroscience that Marius mentioned. Yeah, thanks again for having me. This is really a pleasure to be here, and please stop me if you want to ask questions throughout, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these projects. Okay, so I guess I'll get going then. So what I study in my research program is perceptual metacognition. So I like to start a lot of the talks I give with a slide that looks like this, because I think that it presents a really intuitive way for everybody to get on the same page about what I mean by perceptual metacognition. So this is not judgments of learning. This is not kind of cognitive judgments about probability. This is really a judgment that you, everybody in this room, is doing all the time, every day, at every moment, which is you're trying to evaluate the incoming sensory information available to you through your eyes, ears, and other senses in order to make inferences about the most likely state of the environment, so that then you can move on to make adaptive choices about how to behave. And so in this toy example here, this is you, and you have eyeballs, and you're driving down this foggy road, looking at this scene, and it's wet, and it's raining, and it's dark, and your system is tasked with deciding what this thing is there in the road up ahead that you can barely see. And so let's say in this toy example that this is a deer, a car, or a tree, for the sake of argument. But along with your judgment about the most likely identity of this object that's out there in the world on the basis of probabilistic computations, comes along for free this sense of confidence or certainty in your decision. So having decided that this is probably a car, you also get a sense of confidence. How sure are you that this is a car? And so this is a judgment that will affect your future decisions about how to behave, whether to swerve, whether to brake, whether to just keep driving straight along the road, and so on. Not just the identity judgment, but also this certainty judgment. And this is therefore not only an important decision or an important capacity for humans and other animals to be able to have, but for those of you in the room who might think about how to build better and smarter artificial systems, this is also something that we want to build into our artificial systems, is the capacity not only to make adaptive decisions and inferences in the face of noisy information, but also to judge the probability that those decisions are correct, that they provide true information about the environment. So this is the main thrust of what we study in my lab and what I'm going to talk about today. So this is the core that everything kind of comes back to. And so I wanted to today to talk about kind of three big questions, or three sections of this talk. So the first is I want to convince you why studying metacognition is exciting and interesting, not just from the perspective of cognitive science and human decision making, or from the perspective of artificial systems, but also because I know that this is a strongly philosophical group as well. I think that there are some really nice reasons to study metacognition from a philosophical perspective, specifically focusing on trying to get a handle on consciousness. And then I'll walk you guys through some recent findings that we've published in the past few years, and also some ongoing work that we have. And I'm particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on some of that ongoing work, because some of it is in revision. It's not quite published yet. And so if you guys have critiques or comments, I'd love to hear them. Okay. And I'll also remind everybody that my work is primarily in humans. I have collaborated with some animal researchers in the past, but primarily I work in humans, and the stuff that we'll be talking about today is all human work. Okay, so let's start with why study metacognition. So I think there are some kind of practical reasons why metacognition is really an interesting thing to study, especially if we want to get at consciousness and subjective experience, but also from the perspective of artificial systems and so on. And that is that on the surface, metacognitive computations are objectively definable. A metacognitive decision or judgment is a decision about a decision. So having decided it's a car, that's a type 1 decision. You make a judgment about that decision, about the quality or output of that decisional process. But these are objectively definable. You can say there's a thing out there in the world, and here is the signal to noise ratio of that stimulus. And here, therefore, is an optimal or heuristic judgment that you might make about that stimulus. And then you can also continue to write down mathematical expressions and computational models that link that type 1 decision about it is a car to a type 2 decision about I think I'm right or not. So we can write down these equations, and that's really convenient and powerful from an experimental perspective. But also this particular system, I think, is a hard and exciting one to study, because in writing down this system, because the second order decision is about a first order decision, it's actually computationally really hard. You've got these 2 links to multiple hidden variables and states of the world that we cannot observe, that are all living inside your mind. And your definition of the link between type 1 behavior and type 2 judgments is dependent on your definition of the link between the external world and the type 1 behavior. So I'll show you a graphic of this in a second, but what this means is that we really can get a lot of power from ideal observer models and other techniques and tools that have been developed over the past 70 years to target perceptual decision-making. Now we can point all the power of those computational frameworks at metacognition, and I think we really will be able to get somewhere. So I think that these 2 properties of metacognition lend it sensitivity and specificity that we cannot necessarily get out of models of type 1 decisions alone. So here's the graphic that I promised to show you, that basically you have this stimulus that's out there in the world. This is an observable. We can objectively look at this thing. This is like the stimulus we display on a computer screen. But then you have a process that links this stimulus to a type 1 decision or a type 1 representation. And we have a readout mechanism that leads us from this representation to like its optimal estimate, the behavioral response that people give. But then there are also other factors that might lead into this function. So there might be factors of a priori beliefs, or emotional state of the observer, or history within the system, or whatever that might also go into this this type 1 representation and decision process. And then we have another entire layer that does the same thing all over again, that takes in the same inputs and the same information that's available to the type 1 system, and potentially also some other stuff as well. So there have been some interesting studies showing that messing around with motor preparation and execution actually changes confidence without touching the bottom half of this graph. And so I think that thinking about it and conceptualizing it in this way, and recognizing that there are actually 3 hierarchically interdependent anchors that we have to fit our models to. We have to fit them to this, and to the linkage between the 2 in order to get this right. So this really makes the models of metacognition really sensitive and really specific. It's really easy to write down the wrong model and have it break under a very carefully constructed experiment. So given those properties, I think metacognition is very intriguing from a scientific standpoint. From a philosophical standpoint, it's also nice to link to consciousness, because there does seem to be at least from some perspectives, something that it is like to feel sure. This does have subjective or phenomenal character. And so maybe we can make the argument that this is at least related to the hard problem of consciousness for those of you who might want to tackle that. So,
Megan,
yes.
Joel has a question here.
Yes.
He's asking why stop at layer 2 and not have a meta cognitive judgment of confidence at the level 2 decision? I guess that's
sure. Why not? Absolutely. I'm going to try to do this one first, and then I'll try to get to the next one. But I agree that this could become a kind of turtles all the way down problem. But it's going to be. I'd like to start with trying to get at these three. I think these three are hard enough, but I agree that one could layer, especially for self-reflective awareness or reflective consciousness, one could layer a third hidden node up here. Or one could also posit that like self-reflective awareness, like the I or me in that subjective feeling might be a component of this Y representation. I think that's a subject that we could actually write down and operationalize in that way. I'm just not doing it quite yet, but it's a great question. Okay, so great. So what I'm going to tell you about today then is, if we buy that this framework is appropriate and kind of interesting, and if I've convinced you of that at least a little bit, I wanted to tell you about how computationally and in terms of their neural implementation, we've been studying this in my group, and starting when I was a postdoc through the past few years of my my faculty positions. And so most of what we'll talk about today is psychophysics and non-invasive neurostimulation and computational modeling. I have one slide where I shove ECOG and biologically plausible neural networks together, but mostly we're going to be hanging out over in this realm. So let's talk then about some recent findings from our work. Although I suppose I can pause here and see if there are any other questions about kind of the motivation before we move on. Anybody else want to ask a question? Okay, all right. So recent findings. So one of these is, I think there were a few of you who read this paper in your journal club. So hopefully, and there were some great questions sent to me about these papers as well. So the first paper I wanted to talk about was this paper that I did when I was a postdoc back in 2015 with Hakwan. And our target here was, if we want to study metacognition specifically, one of the problems is that metacognitive evaluation and the feeling of confidence is almost always confounded with type 1 performance. The better you can do on a task, the more confident you feel, and the better you feel like you can see the thing, and vice versa. And so you have to design these experiments so that you can get conditions where you can perform a task without confidence or without awareness, or vice versa. You have to experimentally dissociate the two. So one of the favorite paradigms to do this in previous years has been to use a very standard approach like this, where I show you a thing on a screen, and I ask you to make some decision about the identity of that stimulus. And then I ask you to provide a confidence or awareness judgment about your decision, or about the stimulus itself, but about the decision if it's confidence. And then I post hoc go in and find all of the answers where you said, yes, I see the same thing, or yes, I have high confidence. And all of the trials where you said, no, I don't see the thing, or I don't have high confidence, I have low confidence. And I do a subtraction between these two in terms of neural activity or behavioral outputs or some other outcome metric that I'm really interested in. And this provides, ideally, an isolation to say, okay, what is the neural correlate or computational correlate of confidence? What makes confidence higher in one condition than another? What brain areas are involved and what are they doing? So does this subtraction kind of make sense to most people, what people are doing? Okay, so one really important factor here, and that has been driving the idea that patients with blind sight are particularly intriguing for this subtraction, is that you can, in theory, create conditions where your ability to do the task, to provide meaningful responses about the identity of the stimulus when you say, yes, I have high confidence, and your ability to do the task when you say, no, I don't have high confidence, or I didn't see the thing. If I can match these two in terms of the D prime, the signal detection metric D prime of performance, so your percent correct is ideally matched between these two, then what I've done with this subtraction is actually isolate just the bits of the brain or the bits of the computation that are about confidence alone. I've subtracted off the performance component or controlled for that performance component so that the only thing left over is differences in confidence. Ideally, what this does is it experimentally isolates confidence in terms of its neural and computational correlates. But there's a problem with this particular approach, which is that just because I say high or low confidence, especially low confidence, doesn't mean that I actually had zero awareness of the stimulus. This has been used in blind sight studies previously where I mask the stimulus and I say, aha, I made it invisible, but I didn't destroy your ability to do the task. So therefore, I've created conscious and unconscious conditions, or confident and completely not confident conditions. And therefore, I can do the subtraction and end up with this is the confidence bit of the brain or the computation. But this is susceptible to response bias. Just because I say I have no confidence at all, or I have no awareness of the stimulus, doesn't mean that there is actually nothing that it was like to experience that stimulus. So this confound was first noted by Erickson in like 1960. So it's not anything new. And there have been a number of attempts to fix it. But we thought, well, maybe we can rely on the bias-free nature of a two-interval forced choice, but point it at the confidence judgment, and therefore get around this potential response bias confound. So we changed the study here so that we show you a stimulus and we ask you to make a decision about it. And then we show you another stimulus and we ask you to make a decision about that. And then we force you to compare those two decisions to say which one you feel more confident in. So there's no option here to say, I am not confident or I am confident. It's only which decision do you feel more confident in? And the sneaky thing that we did then is we actually removed the target entirely in one of the intervals. So this provides a floor on what confidence should be. I'm asking you to make a decision about a stimulus that's physically not there. And so this should be the minimum confidence that you could ever possibly experience in this paradigm. And then in the other interval, I'm showing you the actual stimulus being present. So the goal here is to create conditions or to identify whether it is possible to create conditions where when you are when you are able to do the task, you have absolutely no awareness of the stimulus. Is that even possible to create something that looks like blind sight in normal observers? Because that would be a great thing to do from an experimental perspective. So we're not relying only on blind sight patients for this type of approach. So what that looks like in this particular paradigm is you can do the task when the target is present, but doing the task is introspectively or subjectively, in terms of the confidence judgment, no different from doing the task based on nothing. That means I've completely turned off the subjective experience. If I can do this, if I can use this paradigm to induce conditions where you can do the task, but you are totally unconscious of your capacity to do the task, then it should be possible to actually create these conditions where D prime is matched between aware and not aware conditions. If I can't, then all of the studies that try to do this thing up at the top might be flawed in some way. So that was our goal. We did this study using forward-backward masking with an oriented Gabor patch. The task is this stripy thing tilted left or right from vertical. And we do this with a bunch of different contrasts. So I show you like mask, mask, target, mask, mask, or mask, mask, nothing, mask, mask. And we then measure your D prime or your percent correct in this case, and your confidence in this betting task at each of these levels. And what we're looking for to identify whether blind sight is possible, truly possible, is if we plot your ability to do the task on the x-axis against your ability to bet on the interval that has the target in it, where you should be able to actually do the task. Remember, in the other interval, there's nothing there, so it's like completely impossible to do the task. If we plot the results like this, what we're looking for is a pattern like this. The idea is that you can do the task above chance when there is a target there, but doing that task feels introspectively or subjectively no different from doing the task based on nothing. It is truly an unconscious perception situation. So this is what we're looking for, is some sort of elbow, some sort of ability to do the task above chance, but 50-50 betting on target present and target absent. They both feel subjectively equivalent. They're like subjective metamers. Okay, so we compared, to get back to the computational modeling component, we set up a computational model that we could then compare to human performance to see, are humans doing the ideal observer thing, the mathematically perfect thing, or are they not? Are they doing something that actually suggests that blind sight might be possible? So this is a graphical representation of the computational model that we set up. For those of you who are familiar with Bayesian decision theory or two-dimensional signal detection theory, this hopefully will look slightly familiar, but if we assume that the x-axis is like evidence for left tiltedness and the y-axis is evidence for right tiltedness, then these concentric circles represent Gaussian hills of probability in the generative framework as kind of viewed from above. So you draw a sample from each of these generative distributions, a left tilted thing or a right tilted thing, and then you categorize that sample on every trial according to the posterior probability of left versus right, which in this framework is akin to essentially drawing an identity line and saying, does this dot fall on this side or this side of the identity line? Is it closer to this one or this one? And the degree to which it is closer to the left distribution or the right distribution also drives your sense of confidence in an ideal observer framework. The farther it is from the boundary, the identity line, the more confidence you should feel. So this is the mathematical framework of what we did. This is a very standard, very simple Bayesian ideal observer, where in the target present interval, we draw a sample from either the left distribution or the right distribution. In the target absent interval, we draw a sample from the noise distribution. There's actually nothing there. So it's centered at 0, 0. We calculate for both samples the posterior probability of left versus right. And then we compare those two posterior probabilities, and that's the one that the model bets on. And what this looks like in the graph that I showed you previously is something that looks like this. So as your ability to tell left versus right increases, your ability to bet on the target present interval also increases. And the reason that this is not an identity, that this doesn't just like crawl up the identity line right here, is that this judgment has one noise source in it. It's just this half of the equation. But this judgment on the y-axis has to compare these two. So it has double noise. So these are our predictions from our ideal observer computational model. And I would just want to point out the extra power we get from adding metacognition into the equation. So if we just had left and right, we would fit our model with like maximum likelihood estimation, the parameters of the model to between the behavior and the response, and we would have, you know, some probability and number of responses for the person and the model that we would be able to compare and like match the parameters of the model so that they maximally predict the human behavior. If we add metacognition and we just like vastly expand the space of that the model has to fit, vastly expand the number of conditions that the model has to fit, and also again, the type 1 and type 2 judgments are not independent. And so the model must be able to get that linkage between type 1 and type 2 judgments correct in order to actually fit this behavior. So those are our predictions from our ideal observer. This is what we're looking like for blind sight. And now the critical question, do people have blind sight or are they ideal observers? And they're ideal observers. In 2 experiments that we did here, we saw no trace of blind sight at all. We did a follow-up study where we did it with facial emotion processing. We did a follow-up study where we did it with continuous flash expression. And in all of these follow-up studies, basically what we found is as soon as you are able to discriminate the target above chance, you are able to introspect on your choices. So this suggests that either it's not possible to achieve blind sight-like behavior in normal observers, or it's at least a lot harder than we thought, which makes a little bit of the previous literature on this, where they use that subtraction method, a little bit suspect. So with those bias-prone older paradigms, near threshold perception appeared to be introspectively inaccessible, subjectively no different from nothingness. But when we push them a little bit further, perception is not actually unconscious, at least with any of these techniques. But then on the methodological side, this also shows that we can capture, we can model and quantify the computations of metacognition from stimulus through type 1 all the way up to type 2 behavior with these computational modeling frameworks. So this is the cartoon version of this project. And there's some other kind of details in this paper as well that we can go into later if you want. But I think that this demonstrates that metacognition is viable to grab at with computational models, but that it also is viable for model arbitration. And I'm going to push on that a little bit more to say, okay, well, maybe you don't believe that masking is strong enough or the right technique or something. And so we can't really conclude that people are ideal observers. We don't have enough evidence to say, oh, okay, well, obviously they're ideal observers. We didn't have a giant slew of alternative frameworks, and none of the alternative frameworks worked better than the ideal observer either. So we can say of the ones we tested, the ideal observer worked best. But is that actually the one that describes what metacognitive computations are happening in the brain? So to answer that question, we did a follow-up study using transcranial magnetic stimulation to primary visual cortex. That bump on the back of your head, you guys are all vision scientists, I don't need to do that. And so we have the same paradigm, but now we zap you when the target is present, and we don't zap you when the target is absent, or we counterbalance these so you don't kind of catch on to our trickery. So the zaps and the target present is all counterbalanced and completely pseudo-randomized. But the idea is the same. We show you a thing, ask you to judge it, and we zap you, which is supposed to turn off your consciousness without destroying your ability to do the task, according to previous literature. And then we show you nothing, and we don't zap you, and we ask you which one you're going to bet on. Now we run that same ideal observer and we compare it to human performance, and it doesn't work anymore. In fact, it does really, really terrible at describing what the people are doing. So now what we've done is we show that this is the model, this black line here, and the model understands that the zapping made it worse at the task, which is what it's doing. It's kind of injecting noise into the stimulus. It's reducing the performance. So we fit the model to the performance reduction and then look at what should happen with confidence. And what we find is that the model understands that its performance went down when it got zapped. So it feels less confident, But the people don't do that. The people bet on the zapped interval more than they should. So we've simultaneously reduced their ability to do the task by zapping them, but we've made them feel like they're doing better. And this is not at all what the ideal observer predicts. So to answer what is going on then, we had to do a model comparison where we take the ideal observer, which is the model that I just showed you, and we compare this to a heuristic observer that we built. And the heuristic observer has one important distinction from the ideal observer and is otherwise identical. The ideal observer knows that the noise increased due to the zapping. So we allow it to re-estimate its own noise after the zapping has occurred. We inject noise into the model, and then we allow it to re-estimate the variance-covariance structure of the generating distribution. We don't allow the heuristic observer to do that. We say, you must use the variance-covariance structure that you thought was there to begin with. You're not allowed to estimate this trial by trial. It's the only difference between the models. And now the heuristic model captures the behavior. So now what this suggests is that, and it's not perfect, of course, but it's much better. And what this suggests is that now people are not ideal observers. They're ideal observers as long as you don't mess up the noise structure in their brain in a way that deviates from what they expect it to be. Then if you do that, then they use what they expected the noise to be, never mind what it actually was. And these are cartoon models again, but I think they start to paint the picture that not only are people potentially suboptimal in their metacognitive computations, but they're suboptimal in a very specific way. And so now we can start to design multiple heuristic observers that have slightly different ways in which confidence is estimated that we can compare among, and we can start to try to design experiments that will arbitrate these models. So I'm going to very, very quickly just mention two other studies that we did. One is an ECOG study where we've got electrode recording straight from the surface of the cortex. And the task is show you a stimulus. Is it a face or a house? Rate your confidence. So this is actually an older paradigm. We were reusing a data set here. And then we use a support vector machine classifier to decode what's going on from the time frequency decomposed signals from the ECOG recordings. And without going into many, many details, this paper is a little bit of a beast, but we take the output of these decoding signals and translate it into something that we can feed into these kinds of models that I presented earlier. So we kind of factorize out pure face evidence and pure house evidence, and we can place it in these two-dimensional Bayesian decision theoretic frameworks and ask which model actually fits confidence judgments in this paradigm better. And so through some quantitative model comparisons, what we found in this case, this is our ideal observer from before. This is a different heuristic observer that we developed for this task. This is the one that won. So once again, the ideal observer is not winning. People are performing these confidence judgments in ways that significantly deviate from the simplest possible way we could think of them doing them. And this gives us a real handle on how to write down those specific computations linking the type 1 behavior to the type 2 behavior. And then another study that we did that has recently been accepted to PLOS Computational Biology, so we're very happy about that, is to say, okay, if this is the winning model, this is not what the brain has. The brain doesn't have Gaussian distributions that generate samples. The brain has neurons. So how in the world could the brain actually produce something that looks computationally like this? So we developed this competing accumulator evidence accumulation kind of framework where some neurons are strongly inhibited, or some neural populations are strongly inhibited by neurons that have opposing tuning preferences. So I'm a neuron that likes left tilted stuff. I really am going to inhibit neurons that like right tilted stuff. And then there's also neurons that just accumulate evidence and don't listen to their neighbors. So they just like left tilted stuff, and they don't care whether someone else in the neighborhood is liking right tilted stuff. And we hypothesized that based on some other theoretical work that these neurons that kind of listen to their neighbors, that receive inhibition from neurons with opposing tuning preferences, that these compute the relative evidence for multiple stimulus alternatives and therefore are good candidates for driving the decision process. But what we saw here and what we've seen in some of the previous work is that once you've made a decision, you seem to have this kind of confirmation bias that strong evidence favoring your decision is weighted more heavily in the confidence judgment than it should be. And this suggests that the relative evidence is not what is going into the confidence judgment. It's just the absolute magnitude of the evidence supporting your decision. So we see confirmation biases in cognitive decisions all the time in terms of having decided to vote for political candidate A, you can assume that that candidate does no wrong, and anything that suggests that that candidate is a bad person, you're just going to conveniently ignore. We see those kinds of biases now all the way down at the perceptual level. Yeah, Joel.
Do you see any difference? So it sounds like you're describing something like overconfidence, where people like think their decisions are good, even if that doesn't match their actual performance. And I wonder if you see a difference in terms of individuals with sort of education levels or like levels of training, where you basically need to have a good internal model of your likelihood of getting the right answer.
That's a really interesting question. So this is related to kind of an overconfidence effect that you might see for sure. It's a little more nuanced than that. This graph shows that you can actually use this to make people better and better and better at the task, but then have their metacognitive sensitivity get worse and worse and worse. So their confidence starts oppositely tracking their accuracy. So you create conditions where they feel really confident when they're wrong and really not confident when they're right. And it's kind of very bizarre. But your question about education level, so Steve Fleming has a couple recent papers on this. where they looked at education level and political extremism and a couple other kind of demographic factors to look at how these confirmation biases and the overconfidence effect interact with some of these other demographic measures. Yeah. So the short answer is, I don't know about education. With political biases, the more extreme you are in either direction, really strong left or really strong right, the worse your metacognitive sensitivity is, and the worse you are able to take into account new information, the more stuck in your ways you are. So I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but it's maybe close. Okay. All right. So we built this this biologically plausible, in quotes, computational framework that's a little bit more neuron-like than some of these really high-level Bayesian frameworks. And so some of the ongoing work now that we're doing is trying to develop this further and compare it to these in a way that allows us to identify which paradigms are ideal for arbitrating among these competing theories, these competing models of confidence computations. So that's the last thing that I wanted to talk about today, is some ongoing work that we're doing that's in revision right now. And so we have the ability to really, both of these things that I wanted to briefly mention are out in preprint. So I would love to hear your feedback if you've got some reviews and some things that we need to fix before they really kind of go to the finish line. So the take-home message from what I've presented so far is that we need to find ways to experimentally dissociate performance and confidence, to isolate confidence from all of these performance confounds. And we're starting to develop ways through the addition of noise, through the manipulation of evidence strength, and so on. We're starting to find ways to, which factors allow us to actually dissociate these things best. And also we're discovering what we're calling confidence illusions, cases where confidence truly fails to track accuracy, where on a trial by trial basis, I can make you better and better and better at doing the task and less and less and less confident. And that is kind of crazy, but it demonstrates that getting these paradigms right will give us a really powerful experimental tool for understanding those confidence computations. So some of the candidates that have been identified so far are adding noise, like we did with TMS, and a number of other people have done this in other ways. Manipulating evidence strength, where we kind of crank up the contrast a little bit at a time, but we also crank up the noise a little bit at a time, and that makes you feel more and more confident while not actually changing your ability to do the task. And I'll show you an example of those stimuli in a second. That's manipulating contrast and evidence strength there. Those are kind of the same thing. And then I'll also very briefly mention some work that we've started to do on visual field location and how this might be used as a tool as well. So what I mentioned in the previous slides is that we can create these conditions where you have high task performance and low confidence, and where you can have poor task performance and high confidence. Well, these are equally interesting from a scientific perspective for those of you who also have maybe an eye towards applying this in machine learning and AI, or in autonomous artificial systems, for example. This is the one that's actually a little bit scarier, because you could, in theory, manipulate a data stream in a way that makes a human or a machine feel like they're doing great, but they're actually doing garbage at the task. And so in humans, we've seen this in the lab, where we can crank up the contrast on these Gabor patch targets and say, okay, which orientation is stronger? And we can create conditions where the left tilted thing is the same extent stronger than the right tilted thing in both of these conditions. So your D prime is matched between these two, but you feel more confident in this one than you do in this one. So in the lab, we can do that, but in the real world, you could imagine doing this the same way. So this is drone footage that I just pulled off of Google, where this is the original image. It's kind of dark and low contrast, but it has pretty high image fidelity. And all I did here was in PowerPoint, crank up the brightness, but also then add a little bit of noise on top of it. And there's a sense that you feel that you can actually see better in this one than you can in this one, even though I actually messed up the signal to noise ratio in this one. So you can imagine that if machines are susceptible to this, or even if humans who are watching these videos of like live drone footage are susceptible to these confidence illusions, that this is actually a little bit scary and should be paid attention to by some applied scientists as well. So we want to understand why this happens. Why do we feel more confident in some conditions than in others when we actually have exactly the same capacity to do the signal processing in both cases? Where does that come from? And so I wanted to talk about manipulating evidence strength as one of the potential tools for really delving into what the computations look like that give rise to these confidence illusions despite matched performance. So this is where we started before. And so based on kind of these frameworks and this model, coupled with previous research showing that you can have matched performance and different confidence or different awareness. So this is the image I showed earlier. This is an image from Lau and Passingham in 2006. And the idea here is, again, they created conditions with matched performance, but different confidence. This is a graph of performance versus metacognitive sensitivity, showing that I can make you better and better and better at the task, but make your confidence track your accuracy worse and worse and worse, and that our model can actually do that as well. So this together suggests the need for comprehensive exploration of exactly what conditions and manipulations allow us to best pull these things apart. We don't have that yet. We've got a smattering of studies that have said like, hey, if we do this, we can match performance and get different confidence. Or hey, if we do that, we can match performance and get different confidence. So we wanted to develop a framework for quantifying the success of these matched performance, different confidence, or different consciousness frameworks, which allow us to control for those performance confounds by matching D prime, but then pushing around on awareness or confidence independently. And we wanted to develop this framework to quantify the effect so that then we could use it to ask questions about how to maximize the effect experimentally, and how to characterize the functional form of the relationship between type 1 and type 2 performance across a broad range of those relationships. So our target here is to create a way to characterize this relationship between performance, D prime, and confidence on the y-axis, not just in cases where you have matched performance for one condition but different confidence, or even for two conditions but different confidence, but to actually characterize the whole range. What is the shape of this distribution, this function? What are the factors that allow us to maximally dissociate it? Are these supposed to be parallel lines, or is this a horizontal shift in like a psychometric function? Do they diverge in different ways? Does the functional form, the shape of the functional form change under different conditions? We don't know any of that yet, but if we can get some of that locked down, then we can answer some of these questions and maybe design better models and better experiments. So, and then of course, if we get this too, then it doesn't matter if you've created two conditions that seem matched in performance. You can just do this entire type 2 psychometric function and then just choose a particular level of D prime and interpolate what the confidence ought to be. So this is what we're calling the meta-perceptual function. A psychometric function links the stimulus to the type 1 perception. What we're calling the meta-perceptual function links the type 1 perception to the type 2 meta-awareness or confidence judgment. And what we're interested in is identifying the functional form and parametric manipulations that causally matter for this type 2 psychometric function, the meta-perceptual function. So to start with this, we did a giant pile of psychophysics. And essentially the idea is we have this random dot kinematogram motion that is full field all the way across the screen. And in one of these two local patches, a brief period, 533 milliseconds of coherent downward motion shows up, and then it goes back to completely random. And your task is a spatial 2 interval force choice. On which side did you see the coherent motion? And so we can manipulate the difficulty of the task by manipulating the coherence of this dot motion. So it's 100% or 50% or 25% or something. And we can also manipulate the overall evidence magnitude that is available to make your decision by manipulating the density of the entire full field dots on the screen. So we can put 2 dots per visual degree or 35 dots per visual degree. So it's like a flurry snowstorm or like a crazy blizzard. And so that's exactly what we did. And we did this in a blocked design where we have medium density. So this is like kind of a middle snowstorm. This is a flurry, and this is like a blizzard. And we do this in blocks of trials, or we completely interleave the density of all of the trials. And in all of these cases, the difficulty is also completely interleaved. So the only thing that we're changing between the two is the interleaved or blocked nature of the density, amount of evidence available for your decision. Okay. So we take this design and then we're going to put this into our D prime versus confidence framework across all of the levels of D prime that we kind of tested, or all of the levels of difficulty. And in the block design, we see that there isn't a huge effect of density. The lowest density, especially at these high D prime levels, appears slightly less confident. This little green line is a little below the other two, slightly less confident than the other two, but overall there really isn't a very strong effect. But the effect is quite different in the interleaved condition. So now we see cases where across the entire metaperceptual function, the low density condition leads to lower confidence judgments than the medium or the high density conditions. And so we confirmed this with some statistics showing that the matched performance different confidence effects are larger in magnitude in the interleaved than in the blocked design. They're larger at these higher D prime levels, which kind of makes sense. Down here, you're at a floor for performance and confidence anyway. But specifically because this is not a vertical shift of this metaperceptual function. The blue line is not parallel to the green line and just pushed up a little bit. This is a horizontal shift. They all start at the same point down here. And so because this is a horizontal and not a vertical shift, we can rule out that this is just a response bias. Which would indicate that, oh, you tend to give a confidence of 2 when you just like decide that you see a lot of evidence, that this is really evidence in favor of the decision that you're making that seems to be driving confidence judgments. And so this was confirmed by taking the mean of these metaperceptual functions and doing some stats on that, which came out significant. So this is still early stages, and that we're only doing psychophysics right now. But our future work on this project ideally is going to explore multiple functional forms for this. So right now we're fitting a logistic function, but maybe there's a generative model that will provide a better fit to the data. We'd like to eventually develop a toolbox once we get some of these statistical issues sorted out, so that other people can fit the metaperceptual function in their experiments, so that you can characterize, let's say you try a different manipulation and it produces a much bigger effect, or it produces a different effect. This will allow us to get a quantitative tool so that we can identify which conditions and which experimental manipulations maximize our ability to bifurcate, to push apart confidence and performance. And then we'll do kind of model fitting and so on. And then eventually, we've got a little bit of pilot data that's not in this preprint, but we're going to throw this in the scanner and see if we can then say, having matched performance across a ton of different conditions, where can we find the unique neural correlates of confidence, and what do those patterns look like? Okay, so I have one other thing that I might tell you guys about, although we're running a little bit long. So maybe I'll just do that really quickly, if that's okay. Okay, so the last one is a paper where we're, instead of using evidence strength manipulation or contrast, we're actually relying on some earlier work showing that visual field location, and particularly its interactions with attention, can also lead to performance confidence dissociations. So there's, as we all know in this room, you're much better at identifying the object identity of a stimulus in the center of your visual field. You have much higher visual acuity in the fovea than you do in the periphery. And so despite the fact that the center of your visual field has higher spatial acuity and also leads to higher confidence, there's some really beautiful work by Rachel Dennison and Marissa Carrasco on this. And the periphery leads to lower spatial acuity and therefore lower confidence. Like you do worse at identifying stuff in the visual periphery. We can also see some really interesting cases where, despite the fact that your visual periphery is terrible at spatial acuity and identifying objects and the color of objects also, like you physically do not have the machinery to see color really in a saturated manner in your visual periphery, but you feel like you kind of can. And you feel in some of these previous experiments by Dobirenev and Gisha Solovey and some others, that you really can see in the visual periphery, even though objectively we know you can't identify things with high fidelity. And this picture I stole from a TICS article from Hakwon Lau and David Rosenthal in 2011, where he's showing that this is truly a representation of the actual information available to your visual system as a function of visual field eccentricity. In the center, we see high fidelity and we have color receptors. And in the periphery, we have low fidelity and we don't really have any, or we have a few cones here and there, but not very many. But this is the perception that we have of the world. If you just sit here right now and you kind of attend to your visual periphery, it doesn't look fuzzy and black and white. That's not our experience of our visual periphery. It feels, well, it doesn't feel black and white for sure. And there have been some really nice experiments recently showing that people kind of don't notice color saturation changes in the visual periphery, but they just feel like they can see the color the whole time, even if you're messing with it. So this suggests that we have this kind of subjective inflation or an inflated sense of confidence in our visual periphery over and above the confidence that would be expected based on your performance capacity. So once again, an opportunity to bifurcate confidence from performance capacity. So the last thing I'll say here is that we're developing a computational framework that suggests, on the basis of some earlier work, that what the brain is doing is estimating noise in the center and in the visual periphery in a hierarchical fashion, not just estimating a direct, like it doesn't have direct access to the uncertainty in the type 1 representation. It has a prior expectation of what that uncertainty ought to be based on, conditioned on visual field location. And it uses that with an instantaneous estimate of noise, combining them optimally using Bayes' rule to say, what is the noise currently happening in my system? And then that is the noise that then drives the type 1 and type 2 judgments. So, so this is a representation of what that might look like, that in the center of your visual field, you have pretty low noise in general. You have pretty high fidelity of high signal to noise ratio. And in your peripheral location, because noise is actually, it's impossible for noise to go below 0. So this would probably be a positively skewed distribution that has a higher mean. We can suggest that these are actually like the kind of empirical statistics or natural scene statistics, but of noise now instead of like orientation or spatial frequency in the world. And what we're making the assumption of, I see a question, but let me just get through this real quick. What we're making the assumption of is that this is the true empirical distribution of noise in the center and periphery of the visual field, but the visual system is using a heuristic. It doesn't know that this is entirely skewed. It doesn't want to represent the third moment of this distribution. It just says, oh, noise is bigger in the periphery than it is in the center. And I'm going to just say that I've just moved the mean of this distribution, but I assume that the distribution of noise in the periphery is symmetric. Okay. And then I see a question here. Hang on.
It wasn't a question, it was
a
thank you, they had to go.
Okay,
Go on.
Sorry. Okay, so we then built a bunch of these computational models that said on every trial, the true noise in the world is drawn from one of these, this distribution or this distribution, depending on whether the model is doing a central or peripheral task. And that sometimes the model has a true understanding of what the actual noise statistics are, and sometimes it uses this heuristic kind of approximation. And then those noise levels that get drawn on every single trial are used to build a signal detection framework, and then it does decisions and confidence on the basis of that. And so we built a bunch of these models, and I won't go into too many details here, but just basically The first two are ones that don't assume anything about these hierarchical kind of natural statistics of noise. They just kind of are standard signal detection theoretic approaches. And the last three use these hierarchical kind of natural statistics of noise, natural scene statistics, but in various ways. One of them has true understanding of the actual like distribution of noise in the environment, including its skew. One of them uses just the maximum likelihood, the mode of this prior distribution as just like, I'm going to pick the most likely noise that occurs here. And I'm not going to do any other estimation other than that. And then this final one assumes, excuse me, that that the current noise that it's experiencing is drawn from a Gaussian distribution instead of from a skewed distribution. So it takes an estimate of the current noise, combines that with a prior expectation of what the noise ought to be conditioned on visual field location, and then builds a little decision system and then spits out a decision and a confidence judgment. And this is a kind of complicated graph, but I'll just walk you through very quickly. The columns in panel A are these 5 models, the 2 flat models and the 3 hierarchical models. The rows are center versus periphery. And then along the x-axis is the true noise in the world. And along the y-axis is the confidence judgment that the observer spits out. And so, sorry, confidence judgment in red and performance in black. And so the idea here is that as noise increases, your performance drops, which it should, but confidence doesn't necessarily drop along with it. So the flat Bayesian ideal observer and this hierarchical Bayesian ideal observer that truly understands that the peripheral noise prior distribution, empirical prior, is skewed, they drop their performance and confidence kind of in concert with each other. It's not perfect here, but they're pretty darn close. But the other models don't necessarily do that. And so if we kind of collapse each of these panels, we average it across noise. That's what's plotted in B. And this shows that relative to performance, confidence is massively overestimated in the periphery in particular for the flat 2 model, this fixed criterion heuristic model, for the hierarchical 2 model, which uses kind of its best estimate of what kind of noise typically happens in that part of my visual field, but also for what would otherwise be a Bayesian ideal observer. But the only mistake that this Bayesian ideal observer made is that it thought that the peripheral noise empirical distribution is Gaussian and not skewed. That's the only mistake that it made, but it still overestimates confidence because it forgets that noise could kind of go off into the higher levels. So I'm happy to talk about this more. I know that this is kind of a very quick and dirty overview of this project, but I would love to hear your feedback if you guys have some. So this future work will fit model parameters to existing data sets. We haven't quite done that yet. And we're going to try to make some predictions for new experiments so that we can kind of arbitrate among these models. And then we'll combine it with the meta-perceptual functions, I hope. So that's basically all I wanted to say today, is that metacognitive computations, I think, give us a really nice handle on trying to understand what's going on in phenomenology, but they also have like a lot of really practical elements to them, a lot of practical positives that lead to metacognitive models being much more specific and much more sensitive than models of type 1 behavior alone. This gives us a really nice framework to go searching for the neural correlates of confidence independent of performance. So we can really just get at that one set of computations. And then if you buy the argument from the very beginning, this might actually give us a handle on consciousness, or at least one itty bitty step forward in solving that problem. So that's all I'm going to say. Sorry, I went a little bit over time, but thank you very much for all of your attention. And I would love to have some questions and comments.